The November of 1894 brought with it a succession of fogs so dense and persistent that even the most seasoned Londoners spoke of them with a mixture of awe and trepidation. On the evening of which I write, the 28th of that month, the yellow pall that had settled over our great city seemed to possess an almost malevolent quality, transforming familiar thoroughfares into alien landscapes and reducing the cheerful glow of gas lamps to mere pinpricks of light in an ocean of murk. I had spent the better part of the afternoon in my consulting room in Paddington, attending to a succession of patients whose various ailments seemed somehow amplified by the oppressive atmosphere. When I finally made my way through the fog-choked streets to our lodgings at 221B Baker Street, I found myself looking forward to nothing more than a quiet evening by the fire, with a good book and perhaps a glass of something warming. I discovered Sherlock Holmes exactly as I had left him that morning, coiled in his armchair like some great contemplative cat, surrounded by a litter of newspapers and chemical apparatus. The air was thick with the smoke of his strongest tobacco, and his lean profile was etched sharply against the lamplight as he bent over a series of newspaper clippings, arranged with mathematical precision upon the table beside him. "Ha, Watson," he said, without looking up, "I perceive that your afternoon rounds took you first to Mrs. Henderson's establishment in Marylebone Road, then to the Wigmore Street area, where you paused at the post office before ultimately deciding against sending a telegram to your brother in Birmingham." I paused in the act of removing my overcoat, staring at him in that familiar mixture of exasperation and admiration that his casual demonstrations of deduction invariably provoked. "Holmes," I said, settling into my chair, "while I have long since ceased to be amazed by your methods, I confess I am curious as to how you arrived at such specific conclusions." He glanced up with the slight smile that always accompanied his more theatrical revelations. "Elementary, my dear fellow, the hem of your coat bears traces of a particular shade of clay that is found only in the immediate vicinity of Mrs. Henderson's house, where the recent water main repairs have exposed the distinctive reddish earth of that district. Your right boot, moreover, shows evidence of the specific granite chips used in the road work currently disrupting the pavement outside the Wigmore Street post office. But the telegram to my brother. You have ink stains upon your right index finger, indicating recent writing, yet protruding from your breast pocket is a crumpled telegraph form. Had you sent a message, the form would remain with the postal clerk. Since it is still in your possession, you clearly wrote it, but ultimately decided against transmission. The fact that you have mentioned your brother's financial difficulties twice in recent weeks suggests the nature of the intended communication. "Remarkable," I murmured, though I had long since learned that such displays were mere exercises for Holmes, intellectual calisthenics, to keep his extraordinary mind sharp during periods of professional inactivity. The arrival of Inspector Lestrade. As if summoned by our conversation, the sound of hurried footsteps echoed from the stairs below, followed by Mrs. Hudson's voice raised in mild protest. A moment later, our landlady appeared in the doorway, her usually composed features showing signs of flustered concern. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," she began. "I do apologize, but Inspector Lestrade insists." She was gently moved aside by the familiar, wiry figure of Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard, his sharp features more pinched than usual, and his clothes bearing the unmistakable dampness of the London fog. In his hand he clutched a folded newspaper, which he brandished as though it were evidence of some particularly heinous crime. Mr. Holmes, he said without preamble, I've brought you a case that has me as puzzled as I've ever been. A locked room, a dead man, and a mystery that seems to mock every principle of logical investigation. Holmes's eyes immediately sharpened with interest. He gestured toward the chair near the fire. Pray warm yourself, Lestrade, and tell us your story. Watson, perhaps some brandy for our colleague. He appears to have had a trying evening. Lestrade accepted the offered refreshment gratefully before beginning his account. It concerns a gentleman named Silas Markham, a wealthy recluse who occupied a set of rooms in Montague Street, Bloomsbury, found dead this evening under circumstances that defy explanation. In what manner? Holmes inquired, his fingers already steepled beneath his chin in that characteristic pose of intense concentration. Mr. Markham was discovered in his locked study, apparently dead of natural causes, heart failure, according to the police surgeon. The door was bolted from within, the window secured, and no sign of foul play evident. Under normal circumstances, we would have closed the matter as a regrettable but unremarkable death. Yet you are here, Holmes observed. What circumstances render this case remarkable? Lestrade unfolded the newspaper he had been carrying. Because of this, Mr. Holmes. For the past fortnight, this advertisement has appeared in the Evening Standard every 3 days, always in the personal column. He handed the paper to Holmes, who read aloud. To S.M. The Kindle burns at the appointed hour. Watch for the signal. All proceeds as planned. C. S.M., I presume, being Silas Markham? Holmes inquired. So we believe. But here's the truly baffling part, Mr. Holmes. According to his landlady, Mrs. Pemberton, and confirmed by other residents of the building, Mr. Markham had developed a peculiar ritual over the past 2 weeks. Every evening, when this advertisement appeared, he would place a lighted candle in his front window at precisely 10 o'clock. The candle would burn for exactly 50 minutes, then be extinguished, and the curtains drawn. Holmes leaned forward, his interest clearly piqued. And last evening, the advertisement appeared as usual. At 10 o'clock, the candle was lit and placed in the window, observed by multiple witnesses. But instead of being extinguished after 15 minutes, it continued to burn. By 10:30, the neighbors grew concerned. By 11, they had summoned the constable. When we forced entry to the room, we found Mr. Markham dead in his chair. The candle burned nearly to its base upon the window-sill. The time of death. Here's where it becomes impossible, Mr. Holmes. The police surgeon is adamant that, based on the condition of the body, Mr. Markham had been dead for at least 4 hours when we found him. That would place his death at approximately 7 o'clock, 3 full hours before the candle appeared in the window. A silence fell over the room, broken only by the hiss of the gas jets and the muffled sounds of the fog-bound city beyond our windows. Holmes rose and began to pace, his movements quick and decisive, his mind clearly engaged by the puzzle presented. You searched the room thoroughly, he asked. Every inch. We found these among his papers. Lestrade produced several more newspaper clippings, all bearing similar cryptic advertisements, all marked in his hand, all corresponding to evenings when the candle ritual was observed. And the mysterious C who placed these advertisements. No trace, paid for in cash, according to the newspaper office, no description of the person who placed them. Holmes stopped his pacing and turned to face us, his eyes bright with that peculiar fire that I had learned to associate with a case that had thoroughly captured his imagination. Gentlemen, he said, we are presented with a most stimulating problem. A dead man who signals his continued existence hours after his demise, mysterious communications in the public press, and a locked room that appears to have been the scene of an impossible occurrence. Watson, your medical bag and your revolver, if you please. Lestrade, we shall accompany you to Montague Street immediately. He moved to the window and drew back the curtain, peering into the fog-shrouded street below. The game, as I have had occasion to observe before, is afoot, and unless I am much mistaken, this particular game will prove to be one of the most intricate we have yet encountered. As I gathered my things, I found myself wondering what manner of deception could account for a candle lit by dead hands, and what dark purpose lay behind the cryptic messages that had lured Silas Markham to his mysterious fate. The fog seemed to press against our windows with renewed intensity, as though London itself were conspiring to conceal the secrets we would soon attempt to uncover. The hansom cab that conveyed us through the fog-shrouded streets moved at a pace dictated by necessity rather than preference, the driver calling out warnings into the yellow murk that had transformed London into an alien landscape. Holmes sat opposite me in contemplative silence, his sharp profile occasionally illuminated by the ghostly willows of gas lamps drifting past like distant stars. I knew better than to interrupt these periods of intense mental activity, for I had learned that such moments were as essential to his investigative process as the physical examination of evidence itself. The fog seemed to press against our cab windows with malevolent intent, and I found myself wondering what manner of deception could flourish in such obscuring mist. Holmes remained motionless throughout the journey, his eyes closed, yet I was certain his mind was racing ahead to Bloomsbury, constructing and discarding the theories with mechanical precision. Montague Street, when we finally reached it, presented a respectable appearance despite the obscuring vapor. The buildings were of solid Georgian construction, their brick facades weathered by time, but well maintained. Number 17 stood in the middle of the terrace, distinguished from its neighbors only by the presence of a constable stationed at the door, and the conspicuous absence of light from its front windows. Mrs. Pemberton, the landlady, met us in the entrance hall, a stout woman whose face was blotched with tears, and whose hands twisted her apron in obvious distress. She curtsied nervously as Lestrade introduced us, her voice trembling as she confirmed the terrible discovery of her lodger. "Oh, sir, if only someone could explain it," she cried. "To think of poor Mr. Markham sitting up there all alone, and me never dreaming of it." Holmes raised a soothing hand. "You shall tell me all you can presently, Mrs. Pemberton. First, however, I must see the room where he was found." We ascended 2 flights of stairs, past walls lined with faded wallpaper and illuminated by flickering gas jets. The study door bore the violent marks of forced entry, its wood splintered around the lock, though the bolt itself remained in position, mute testimony that the room had indeed been secured from within. The chamber itself was of moderate size, lined with bookcases that spoke of scholarly rather than decorative purposes. A substantial desk occupied one corner, its surface covered with papers and correspondence. Near the window stood the chair where the body had been discovered, though the corpse had been removed to the mortuary. Upon the window sills sat the remains of the mysterious candle, now burned nearly to its base. Holmes moved immediately to examine this crucial evidence, his lens catching the lamplight as he studied every detail of the wax remnants and brass holder. He worked in absolute silence, occasionally making small sounds of satisfaction that I had learned to interpret as signs of significant discovery. The window was secured from within, he asked without looking up. Fastened tight, Lestrade confirmed. The catch was in place when we entered. The drop to the street is 30 feet, with no means of access from outside. Holmes next examined the window frame and curtains with meticulous care. "Observe the curtain, Watson," he said suddenly. "Do you see this faint discoloration near the hem? It is damp, yet the window has been closed against the fog all evening." He knelt to inspect the window sill more closely, picking up an almost invisible pinch of grey dust and rolling it between his fingers before bringing it to his nose. "Most interesting," he murmured, placing the sample in a small envelope from his coat. Moving to the desk, Holmes began examining the scattered papers, paying particular attention to the newspaper clippings bearing the cryptic advertisements. "Watson, observe the dates," he said, holding them to the light. Each advertisement appeared at 3-day intervals, yet not quite regular enough to be predictable. The wording varies slightly, though the essential message remains constant. He turned to Lestrade with sudden intensity. "The body was positioned exactly as we see the chair now?" "Precisely." Mr. Markham was slumped forward slightly, hands resting on the chair arms. No signs of struggle whatsoever. Holmes began measuring the distance from chair to window with his tape. 7 feet, he muttered. "A considerable reach for a dead man, yet perhaps not impossible for a cleverly constructed mechanism." He crawled beneath the desk, emerging moments later with a thoughtful expression. "There is a narrative written here in the language of trifles, gentlemen. The candle was indeed a signal, but who was the intended recipient? And more crucially, who was the illuminator?" Rising, Holmes surveyed the room with that predatory intensity I knew so well. "I shall require complete access to Mr. Markham's effects, his correspondence, and detailed information about his habits and associates. But first, I must examine this room, undisturbed, for the next hour." After nearly an hour of methodical examination, Holmes emerged from the study with that expression of quiet satisfaction that I had learned to associate with significant discoveries. He closed the door carefully behind him and gestured for us to descend to the ground floor, where Mrs. Pemberton awaited us in her modest sitting room. The fire burned cheerfully in the grate, offering welcome relief from the chill that seemed to permeate the upper floors of the house. The landlady's testament. Mrs. Pemberton had composed herself somewhat during our absence, though her hands still trembled as she poured tea from a well-worn service. Holmes accepted a cup with uncharacteristic patience, settling into the horsehair sofa with the air of a man prepared to extract every detail from his witness. "Mrs. Pemberton," he began, his voice gentle but precise, "you mentioned that Mr. Markham was a quiet gentleman, yet I suspect that recent weeks brought changes to his behavior. Pray tell us everything you observed, however trivial it may seem." The poor woman nodded vigorously, clearly grateful for the opportunity to unburden herself. "Oh, sir, you're quite right. These past 2 weeks, he became a different man entirely. Restless, fearful even. He'd pace his room for hours, back and forth, until I thought the ceiling would come down. And the newspapers. He never took a paper before, but suddenly he was buying 3 different evening editions, studying the advertisement columns like they contained the secrets of the universe." "Did he receive visitors during this period?" Holmes inquired. Mrs. Pemberton's expression grew troubled. "That's just it, sir. In the 18 months he'd lodged here, I could count his callers on one hand. But these past months brought 2 individuals I'll not soon forget. The first was a foreign gentleman, dark complexion, pointed beard, and a terrible scar running along his left cheek. His eyes never seemed at rest, always darting about as though he expected trouble. He called himself Carlo, and Mr. Markham would go pale as death whenever he arrived. How many times did this Carlo visit? Lestrade interjected, his notebook at the ready. 3 times that I witnessed, Inspector. Always late in the evening, always departing within the hour. Once I heard raised voices from the study, Mr. Markham saying, "No, no, Carlo, I tell you it's impossible," and the other replying in such broken English I could barely follow. After these visits, Mr. Markham would be agitated for days. Holmes leaned forward with interest. "You mentioned a second visitor." "A lady, sir, though I use the term advisedly. She came twice, dressed entirely in black, with a heavy veil that concealed her features completely. Mr. Markham insisted I show her directly to his study, bypassing the parlor entirely. The first visit left him greatly disturbed, but after the second, which occurred exactly 2 weeks ago, he seemed more resolved, though no less fearful. And it was after this second visit that the candle ritual commenced," Holmes asked. "The very same night, sir. At precisely 10 o'clock, he placed a beeswax candle in his window. He was most particular that it be beeswax, not tallow. For 15 minutes it burned, never more, never less. Then he would extinguish it and draw the curtains. I thought it odd, but Mr. Markham was entitled to his eccentricities. The discovery of evidence." Holmes set down his teacup and withdrew several items from his coat. "Mrs. Pemberton, during my examination of the study, I discovered correspondence that sheds considerable light on recent events. This letter, dated 3 weeks past, is from Messrs. Whitmore and Associates of Lincoln's Inn, informing Mr. Markham of a substantial inheritance, £15,000, contingent upon the death of a distant relative in Yorkshire." Lestrade whistled softly at the sum, while I felt the familiar thrill of a case beginning to reveal its underlying structure. More significantly, Holmes continued, producing a second letter. "I found this communication, received just 5 days ago, written in an educated hand. Dear Mr. Markham, I trust our arrangement proceeds satisfactorily. The final transfer will occur as planned. Ensure the signal is maintained without fail. Your devoted friend, C." "The mysterious C from the newspaper advertisements," I observed. "Precisely, Watson. But there is more." Holmes's eyes gleamed with that peculiar intensity that marked his most significant discoveries. "The physical evidence tells a fascinating story. The candle holder bears traces of an adhesive substance I have encountered only in theatrical mechanisms designed to create timed effects. Beneath the desk, carefully concealed behind the baseboard, I discovered a length of fine wire coiled with mathematical precision." "You suggest some manner of mechanical device?" Lestrade asked, his skepticism evident. "I suggest, Inspector, that we are dealing with a carefully orchestrated illusion. But first, Mrs. Pemberton, one crucial question. Did Mr. Markham possess a walking stick?" The landlady looked surprised. "Why, yes, sir. A heavy thing with a silver knob shaped like a bird's head. He carried it whenever he ventured out, though that became increasingly rare these past weeks." "When did you last see this walking stick?" Mrs. Pemberton frowned, concentrating. "Yesterday morning, sir. He went out for perhaps an hour, most unusual for him lately. He seemed resolved about something when he left, and quite agitated when he returned. I heard him go directly to his study and lock the door. Yet the walking stick is not in his room," Holmes observed, "nor anywhere else in the house." The web of deception. Rising from his chair, Holmes began that familiar pacing that indicated his mind was rapidly assembling the scattered pieces of the puzzle. Gentlemen, we are witnessing the aftermath of an ingenious criminal conspiracy. The candle was indeed a signal, but not lit by the hand we are meant to believe. Consider the timeline. Mr. Markham dies at 7 o'clock, yet the candle appears in his window at 10. The room is locked from within, yet someone must have performed this final act. He paused at the window, gazing out into the fog-shrouded street. Mrs. Pemberton, during these candle displays, did you ever observe anyone watching from the street below? Now that you mention it, sir, there was a gentleman on 2 occasions, tall, well-dressed, standing across the street with his face turned up toward Mr. Markham's window. He carried a distinctive walking stick with a silver handle that caught the lamplight. I remember thinking it odd that anyone would linger in such weather. Holmes exchanged a meaningful glance with me. And when did you last see this observer? 3 evenings ago, sir, during the candle signal. He remained for perhaps 10 minutes before the fog grew too thick. The plot thickens considerably, Holmes murmured, returning to his chair. We have a frightened man receiving mysterious communications, a substantial inheritance at stake, foreign visitors with threatening demeanor, a veiled woman whose arrival coincides with the signal system's commencement, and an observer who watches the ritual with professional interest. He consulted his pocket watch. It grows late, and the fog shows no sign of lifting. Tomorrow morning, Lestrade, I shall require access to Mr. Markham's banking records and a visit to the solicitors regarding his inheritance. But tonight has yielded one crucial insight. The candle was not lit by a dead man, but by the living. The question is not who lit it, but rather when. His cryptic observation hung in the air as we prepared to depart. I knew from long experience that Holmes had grasped some essential element of the mystery that remained hidden from the rest of us. The locked room, the impossible timing, the missing walking stick, all were pieces of a larger design that would soon reveal its deadly purpose. As we stepped back into the fog-shrouded street, I found myself wondering what manner of criminal mind could conceive such an elaborate deception, and what desperate circumstances had driven Silas Markham to participate in his own destruction. The mystery of the candlelit window had only deepened, but I sensed that Holmes was already several steps ahead of both the perpetrators and their carefully laid plans. The grey morning light, filtering through our Baker Street windows, found Holmes already immersed in contemplation, surrounded by a fresh collection of documents that had arrived with the early post. His breakfast lay untouched beside him, a sure sign that his mind was fully engaged with the peculiarities of the Markham affair. The previous evening's fog had lifted, revealing a London that seemed somehow more prosaic in daylight, yet I knew that our investigation was only beginning to penetrate the shadows surrounding the impossible candle. "Watson," Holmes said, without preamble as I entered, "observe these banking statements that Lestrade has procured. Our late Mr. Markham made a series of substantial cash withdrawals over the past month. £500 3 weeks ago, another 500 a fortnight past, and a final, desperate sum of £1,500 withdrawn just 4 days before his death." I examined the documents with growing interest, all in cash, leaving no record of the recipients. Precisely. Yet consider the timing, my dear fellow. These withdrawals preceded his inheritance by weeks. Someone was systematically draining Markham's modest savings in anticipation of the larger prize to come. Holmes rose and moved to the window, his sharp profile etched against the morning light. "We have an appointment with Mr. Whitmore, the solicitor, in 1 hour. I suspect His testimony will prove most illuminating. The solicitor's disturbing revelation. Mr. Augustus Whitmore received us in his Lincoln's Inn chambers with the nervous precision of a man who had spent a sleepless night contemplating his deceased client's affairs. His hands trembled slightly as he arranged the legal documents before us, and his usual professional composure seemed strained by circumstances he clearly found deeply troubling. "Gentlemen," he began, adjusting his spectacles, "Mr. Markham's case presents several disturbing irregularities. The inheritance from his Yorkshire relative was substantial, £15,000, and was due to be transferred to his account tomorrow. However, just 1 week ago, he arrived at my office in a state of extreme agitation and insisted upon making immediate changes to his will." Holmes leaned forward with keen interest. "What manner of changes?" "He left everything, the entire inheritance, to a single beneficiary, Miss Clara Montrose, described as a theatrical performer residing in St. John's Wood. When I counseled caution, suggesting he might wish to consider the matter more thoroughly, he became almost frantic. 'It must be done today,' he insisted, 'before it is too late.'" "Did he appear to be acting under duress?" I inquired. Whitmore nodded emphatically. "Most decidedly, Doctor." His hands shook as he signed the documents, and twice he started violently at sounds from the street below. As he prepared to leave, he made a most peculiar statement. "If anything happens to me, Whitmore, remember that Clara must receive everything. She has arrangements to honor." Holmes had begun his characteristic pacing. "This Miss Montrose, had you any previous knowledge of her?" "None whatsoever. Mr. Markham provided only her address and a brief description as a lady of the theatre, who has shown him great kindness." "Most irregular for a man who had lived so quietly for years." The newspaper connection. Our subsequent visit to the Evening Standard offices confirmed Holmes's suspicions about the mysterious advertisements. The clerk, after consulting his ledgers, provided a description that aligned perfectly with our emerging picture of the conspiracy. "The person who placed the advertisements came in person each time," he reported. "Always a woman, well dressed but heavily veiled, speaking in cultured tones. She paid in cash and provided the copy already written in a careful hand. Never lingered, never engaged in conversation beyond the necessary business." Holmes examined the samples of handwriting with his lens. "Note the deliberate disguise, Watson. The letters formed with unnatural precision to mask the writer's natural style. Yet certain characteristics persist. The formation of the letter C is particularly distinctive." As we departed the newspaper office, Holmes's expression had taken on that quality of intense concentration that indicated his mind was rapidly assembling the scattered elements of the case into a coherent pattern. "The web grows more complex, yet clearer, Watson," he observed, as we walked through the bustling streets. "We have a frightened man systematically drained of his resources, forced to alter his will under duress, and ultimately murdered on the eve of receiving a substantial inheritance. The beneficiary is a mysterious actress who communicates through coded advertisements, yet someone else, our scarred Italian friend Carlo perhaps, was applying the pressure that drove Markham to such desperate measures." He paused at the corner, his eyes distant, but the locked room remains the key to everything. Until we understand how a dead man lit a candle 3 hours after his demise, we cannot hope to unravel the larger conspiracy. This afternoon, Watson, we shall pay a visit to Miss Clara Montrose. I fancy her testimony will prove most enlightening, whether she provides it willingly or not. The morning's investigations had revealed the financial framework underlying the mystery, but the impossible circumstances of Markham's death remained as baffling as ever. As we made our way back to Baker Street, I found myself wondering what manner of woman could inspire such devotion from a terrified man, and what dark arrangements she had made that required his death to fulfill. That afternoon found us traversing the tree-lined avenues of St. John's Wood, where the respectable villas spoke of modest prosperity and theatrical ambitions. The address provided by Mr. Whitmore led us to a handsome house set behind a small garden, its windows adorned with lace curtains that suggested genteel pretensions. Holmes paused at the gate, his sharp eyes taking in every detail of the facade with characteristic thoroughness. "Note the fresh wheel tracks in the gravel drive, Watson," he observed quietly. "Someone has departed within the last few hours, and judging by the depth of the impressions, they carried considerable luggage. Our Miss Montrose appears to be preparing for a journey." "The actress's domain." The maid who answered our knock was clearly flustered, her usual composure shaken by recent events. When Holmes presented his card and mentioned Mr. Markham's name, her expression shifted from wariness to something approaching relief. We were ushered into a drawing-room that bore the unmistakable stamp of theatrical life. Gilt-framed playbills adorned the walls, photographs of dramatic scenes covered every surface, and the faint scent of grease paint and violet water lingered in the air. Holmes moved through the space with predatory grace, his eyes cataloguing details that escaped my notice. He paused before a writing desk positioned near the window, testing each drawer and examining the blotter with his lens. "Someone has been writing here recently, Watson. Observe these faint impressions in the paper, the pressure of a pen wielded with considerable force." Miss Clara Montrose appeared moments later, and I was immediately struck by her compelling presence. She was perhaps 28, with dark hair and pale skin that gave her an almost ethereal quality. Yet there was something in her large, expressive eyes that spoke of recent strain and barely controlled fear. She wore deep mourning, the black fabric emphasizing her dramatic pallor. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes," she said, her voice low and melodious, despite an underlying tremor, "your reputation precedes you. I assume you are here regarding poor Silas." "Indeed, Miss Montrose. His sudden death has raised certain questions that only you can answer." Holmes's gaze was penetrating but not unkind, particularly concerning the substantial inheritance he so recently left to you and the curious circumstances surrounding his final evening. "The web of coercion." Clara sank onto a velvet-covered chaise with a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of accumulated secrets. "I knew this moment would come," she said softly. "Silas was a gentle soul caught in circumstances far beyond his understanding. We met 6 months ago when he attended a performance at the Theatre Royal. He was lonely, frightened, and desperately in need of someone who would listen to his troubles." "What manner of troubles?" Holmes inquired, settling into a chair opposite her. Her hands twisted in her lap, the knuckles white with tension. "His past, Mr. Holmes." Silas had made enemies, dangerous people who had finally tracked him down after years of searching. The man who called himself Carlo was the most terrifying of them, with his scarred face and eyes that promised violence. But behind Carlo lurked someone far more dangerous, a man Silas referred to only as the Professor. Holmes leaned forward with sudden interest. "Describe this Professor." "I never saw his face clearly," Clara replied, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "He remained in the shadows of his carriage when we met. speaking in cultured tones that somehow made his threats more chilling than Carlo's crude intimidation. But I did see his walking stick, silver-headed, carved in the shape of a bird. He would tap it against the carriage roof when giving orders. I saw Holmes's eyes sharpen with recognition. When did you first encounter these individuals? 3 months ago, I was in financial difficulties. My theatrical career had stalled, and I had accumulated debts that threatened to destroy my reputation entirely. Carlo approached me initially as a potential benefactor, offering to settle my obligations in exchange for what he termed a small service. The service, it transpired, was to befriend Silas Markham and gain his trust. The manipulation revealed. Clara rose and moved to the window, her silhouette framed against the afternoon light. At first, I genuinely cared for Silas. He was kind and intelligent, though clearly tormented by his past. But as the weeks passed, the true purpose of my involvement became clear. They wanted me to keep him calm and compliant while they arranged his financial destruction. The inheritance from Yorkshire was the final prize they sought to claim. And the candle ritual? Holmes asked softly. The newspaper advertisements? She turned back to us, tears glistening in her eyes. That was my idea, born of desperation. Silas was becoming increasingly paranoid, convinced that his enemies were closing in. I suggested the candle as a nightly signal. If it appeared in his window, it meant he was safe for another day. The advertisements were my way of coordinating with him, of providing reassurance that escape was still possible. Holmes rose and moved to the writing desk, where he had been examining the blotter paper. Yet these impressions tell a different story, Miss Montrose. The handwriting matches that of the newspaper advertisements exactly. You were not merely providing comfort, you were following specific instructions. Clara's composure finally cracked completely. They forced me. After the first visit to Silas's rooms, the professor made his expectations clear. I was to help implement their plan, or face consequences that would destroy not only me, but also the man I had come to care for. When I accompanied Carlo to see Silas the second time, I witnessed their true nature. The professor had joined us, and his cold calculation terrified me more than Carlo's obvious brutality. The missing link. Tell me about this second visit, Holmes commanded, his voice taking on that steel-edged quality that brooked no evasion. It was 2 weeks ago exactly. The professor insisted on entering Silas's study personally, leaving Carlo and me in the hallway. Through the door, I could hear him speaking in those cultured, threatening tones about final arrangements and ensuring cooperation. When he emerged, he carried something that hadn't been with him when he entered, a walking stick with a silver bird's head handle. Holmes exchanged a meaningful glance with me. Markham's own walking stick. Yes, I realized later that he had taken it as some sort of trophy, or perhaps as a tool for his ultimate plan. Silas never mentioned its absence, but I could see in his eyes that he understood the significance. His last protection had been stripped away. Clara moved to a trunk that sat beside the door, clearly packed for immediate departure. I cannot remain in London any longer, Mr. Holmes. The professor made it clear that once the inheritance was secured, there would be no further need for witnesses to his methods. I have booked passage to Paris on tomorrow's boat train. Holmes's revelation. Holmes had been studying the impressions on the blotter paper throughout Clara's testimony, occasionally making small sounds of satisfaction. Now he looked up with that expression of grim understanding that marked his most significant breakthroughs. Miss Montrose, your account illuminates much that was previously obscure, yet one crucial element remains unexplained. How did the candle appear in Markham's window 3 hours after his death? Clara stared at him in genuine bewilderment. I don't understand. The candle was his signal that he was alive and safe. If it appeared after he died, then someone else must have lit it. But who and why? That, Holmes said, rising and moving toward the door, is the question that will unravel this entire conspiracy. The candle was not a signal of life, but of death, not a message of safety, but a confirmation that the deed was done. The professor's plan was far more intricate than even you realize, Miss Montrose. He paused at the threshold, his expression both sympathetic and stern. You will not flee to Paris tomorrow. Instead, you will remain available to Scotland Yard and assist us in bringing these criminals to justice. Your cooperation now may yet redeem the unwilling part you have played in this tragedy. As we descended to the street, Holmes was silent for several minutes, his mind clearly working through the implications of Clara's revelations. The mysterious professor had emerged as the true architect of Markham's destruction, using both Carlos' intimidation and Clara's desperation to achieve his ends. Yet the mechanism of the impossible candle remained as baffling as ever. Watson, he said finally, as we hailed the cab, we are dealing with a mind of exceptional cunning, one that has turned every element of this case into a weapon against the victim. The walking stick, the inheritance, even Markham's own protective measures have been perverted to serve the murderer's purpose. But in taking Markham's walking stick, our professor has made his first significant error. That silver-headed cane will lead us directly to him. The fog was beginning to gather again as we made our way back through London's darkening streets. The case had evolved from a simple locked-room mystery into a complex web of manipulation and murder, orchestrated by a shadowy figure whose identity remained tantalizingly obscure. Yet I sensed that Holmes was beginning to perceive the true shape of the conspiracy, and that our next moves would bring us face to face with the criminal mastermind who had engineered Silas Markham's impossible death. The early evening found Holmes in a state of feverish activity, having transformed our sitting room into a makeshift laboratory. Upon the chemical table, he had constructed an elaborate apparatus consisting of a candle in a brass holder, surrounded by coils of fine wire connected to a small galvanic battery. His eyes held that peculiar gleam that indicated his mind had grasped some crucial element of the puzzle that remained hidden from the rest of us. Watson, he announced without preamble, observe this demonstration. The wire I discovered behind the baseboard in Markham's study was not debris, but part of an electrical circuit. The impossible candle was lit not by ghostly hands, but by the principles of galvanism that any competent natural philosopher would understand. He adjusted a dial on the battery apparatus. For several moments nothing occurred. Then suddenly a spark jumped from the wire to the candle's wick, which had been treated with some chemical preparation. The flame caught instantly, burning with the steady glow of beeswax. Extraordinary, I exclaimed. But the timing mechanism, how was it controlled? Through a simple clockwork delay, Watson, connected to the circuit. The murderer needed only to set the mechanism and depart. At precisely 10 o'clock, the circuit completed itself. The spark ignited the treated wick, and our impossible signal appeared in the window. The professor's genius lay not in supernatural powers, but in exploiting the scientific ignorance of those who would investigate the crime. The walking stick's secret. Our discussion was interrupted by the arrival of Inspector Lestrade, whose expression combined excitement with professional satisfaction. He carried a familiar object wrapped in brown paper, Markham's missing walking stick with its distinctive silver bird's head handle. "Your theory about the pawnbroker proved correct, Mr. Holmes," he announced, unwrapping the stick carefully. "Found in a shop in Whitechapel, pawned 3 days ago by a man matching Carlo's description. But there's more." The proprietor noticed something unusual about the weight distribution. Holmes seized the walking stick eagerly, his fingers exploring the silver head with practiced precision. After a moment's manipulation, the ornamental bird's head twisted smoothly, revealing that the upper portion of the shaft was hollow. From this concealed compartment, Holmes extracted a small leather pouch and several folded documents. The pouch contained not jewels, as one might expect, but rather a collection of bank drafts and promissory notes, totaling nearly £3,000, the remainder of Markham's liquidated assets, converted to portable form in anticipation of flight. The documents proved even more illuminating, being correspondence between Markham and various European banks regarding the establishment of accounts under assumed names. "The picture grows clearer," Holmes observed, studying the papers. "Markham was not merely a victim, but an active participant in some larger scheme. These preparations for flight suggest he knew his danger and was attempting to preserve what remained of his fortune. The inheritance was merely the final prize in a longer game of financial manipulation." The professor's hand revealed. Lestrade produced a telegram from his coat pocket. "There's been another development, Mr. Holmes. Carlo Ferretti was found dead at Paddington Station 2 hours ago, apparently poisoned. He carried a third-class ticket for Southampton and the boat train to Cherbourg. It appears he was attempting to flee the country when someone decided his continued existence was inconvenient." Holmes' expression darkened as he absorbed this information. The professor eliminates his tools once they have served their purpose. Carlo's death confirms that we are dealing with a mind of exceptional ruthlessness, one that views human life as merely another variable in his calculations. He began pacing with renewed energy, the walking stick still clutched in his hand. "The pattern is now complete, Watson. Markham was systematically drained of his resources through threats and manipulation. The inheritance provided the opportunity for one final, spectacular theft, but the professor's arrogance has proven his weakness. In taking this walking stick as a trophy, he has provided us with evidence of both the method and the motive." The trap springs. Holmes moved to the window, gazing out into the fog-shrouded street with the predatory intensity I knew so well. "The game moves into its final phase, gentlemen. Our professor believes himself secure, having eliminated his primary accomplice and arranged for the inheritance to be transferred to his control through Miss Montrose. But he has underestimated both the evidence he left behind and the determination of those who seek justice." He turned to face us, his decision clearly made. "Lestrade, you must post men around Miss Montrose's residence immediately. She represents the final link in his chain of acquisition, and her usefulness to him is rapidly approaching its end. Meanwhile, Watson and I shall pay a visit to the one location where our professor must eventually appear, the solicitor's office where the inheritance transfer will be completed tomorrow morning." Holmes reached for his coat and revolver, his expression set with grim determination. "Tonight, we set our own trap, using the professor's greed and arrogance as the bait. The man who believes himself a master of impossible crimes is about to discover that the greatest impossibility is escaping the consequences of his actions." As we prepared to venture once more into London's treacherous streets, I felt that familiar combination of anticipation and apprehension that marked our most dangerous cases. The mystery of the candlelit window had been solved, but the capture of its architect promised to test both our courage and our wits in ways we could scarcely imagine. The night before the inheritance transfer, Holmes, Watson, and Lestrade gathered at Mr. Whitmore's chambers at Lincoln's Inn. A dense London fog pressed against the Zawiya windows, muffling every sound and heightening the tension within. Holmes's eyes were bright with anticipation, his movements restless as he reviewed the arrangements. The inheritance documents were laid out on the desk, the bank drafts prepared, and plainclothes officers posted discreetly throughout the building. Holmes glanced at the clock, his fingers tapping an intricate rhythm on the arm of his chair. "He has outmaneuvered us before, Watson," he murmured, "but tonight we have set a stage he cannot resist. The professor's pride is his undoing. He will come himself to witness his victory." Shortly before the appointed hour, Miss Montrose arrived, her face pale beneath her mourning veil, but her spirit unbroken. She greeted Holmes quietly, her hands trembling only slightly as she removed her gloves. "I am ready, Mr. Holmes," she said. "Whatever happens, I will not let his scheme succeed." Whitmore, clearly nervous but resolute, ushered her into his private office. Holmes and Watson took up a concealed position behind a heavy curtain, while Lestrade and his men watched from the corridor. A hush settled over the office. The gas lamps flickered, their glow barely piercing the gloom. Then, the sound of a carriage outside and measured footsteps in the hall signaled the arrival of the final players. The door opened to admit a distinguished man with silver hair, impeccably dressed, carrying an ebony cane with a gold handle. At his side was a younger man, whose left hand remained concealed within his coat. Whitmore rose. "May I help you, sir?" The elder man bowed. "Mr. Edmund Ashworth, legal advisor to Miss Montrose," he announced, his voice calm, authoritative, and edged with calculation. "My associate, Mr. James Ashworth, will assist with the banking arrangements." Holmes's eyes narrowed as he observed from his hiding place. "Observe the younger man's hand, Watson," he whispered. "He favors it, the mark of our poisoner and the likely operator of the electrical device." Ashworth reviewed the documents with swift precision. "If you please, Miss Montrose, your signature on these drafts, and we may conclude our business." Clara Montrose's voice was steady, though her heart clearly raced. "No, Professor," she said, addressing Ashworth by his true title. "Your machinations end here. I will not be party to this crime." The professor's composure slipped, his eyes narrowing with cold fury. The younger man moved, hand emerging with a small revolver. But before he could act, Holmes stepped into the light, his own weapon trained unerringly. "Enough, Professor Ashford, also known as the Professor," Holmes declared. "You are surrounded by officers of Scotland Yard. Your scheme is finished." For a moment, the room was frozen in a tableau of tension. The professor glanced at his accomplice, but realized escape was impossible. Lestrade and two constables burst in, weapons drawn. The professor's shoulders sagged. "A clever trap, Mr. Holmes," he said with a wry smile. "I confess you have outplayed me at the last." Lestrade moved quickly, securing both men. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say." Holmes turned to Clara Montrose. "You have shown remarkable courage, Miss Montrose. By refusing to sign, you deprived the professor of his prize and allowed us to bring him to justice." Clara nodded, relief and exhaustion mingling on her face. The inheritance would pass safely to its rightful recipient, and the web of deception was finally exposed. As the police led the professor and his accomplice away, Holmes allowed himself a rare smile. "Watson, you see how logic and the careful arrangement of facts can undo even the most elaborate artifice. The candlelit window, the mechanical illusions, the threats and manipulations, all were undone by a single act of resolve. I could not help but marvel at Holmes's mastery of the case. Yet as we stepped out into the London night, the fog swirling around us, I sensed that the professor's shadow would linger long after his defeat. Holmes, for his part, seemed already to be turning his mind to the next enigma, his gaze lost in the drifting mists, ever alert for the next challenge. The following morning found Holmes in that peculiar state of restless energy that invariably followed the successful conclusion of a complex case. He had risen early, despite our late return from Lincoln's Inn, and I discovered him in the sitting room surrounded by the various pieces of evidence we had accumulated, the newspaper clippings, the remains of the electrical apparatus, and most prominently, Markham's silver-headed walking stick, which now rested across his knees like some ancient scepter of justice. The unraveling of deception. "Ah, Watson," he said as I entered, "I trust you slept better than I. My mind has been occupied throughout the night with the elegant simplicity of the professor's scheme. It possesses that quality of apparent impossibility which marks the truly superior criminal intellect, until one perceives the underlying mechanism, at which point it becomes almost childishly transparent." I settled into my chair, noting that Holmes had already consumed several cups of coffee and filled his pipe twice, judging by the aromatic haze that permeated the room. "I confess, Holmes, that while I witnessed the capture of our criminals, the precise mechanics of their deception remain somewhat obscure to me. How exactly was a candle lit in a dead man's window 3 hours after his demise?" Holmes' eyes brightened with that peculiar fire that accompanied his most cherished explanations. "The beauty of the scheme, my dear fellow, lay not in supernatural agency, but in the systematic exploitation of scientific principles that the average observer would neither recognize nor understand. Consider the evidence we discovered in Markham's study: the fine wire concealed behind the baseboard, the grey residue upon the windowsill, the faint dampness of the curtain fabric despite the closed window." He rose and moved to the chemical apparatus he had constructed the previous evening. "The wire formed part of a galvanic circuit, Watson, connected to a small battery concealed within the bookcase. The grey residue was metallic powder, specifically platinum in a finely divided state, which possesses the remarkable property of igniting combustible gases upon contact. The dampness resulted from the condensation produced when hydrogen gas burns in the presence of oxygen. The clockwork of murder. Holmes manipulated the apparatus with practiced precision. The professor's device was elegantly simple in conception. A clockwork mechanism, similar to those found in the finest timepieces, was set to complete the electrical circuit at precisely 10 o'clock. When the circuit closed, it released a measured quantity of hydrogen gas from a concealed reservoir onto the platinum powder, causing instantaneous combustion and igniting the specially prepared candle wick. "But the timing," I protested. "How could they ensure Markham would be dead at the appointed hour?" "They could not, Watson, which is why they killed him 3 hours earlier." Holmes' expression grew grave. "The medical evidence was quite clear. Markham died of heart failure at approximately 7 o'clock. But this was no natural death. The tiny puncture mark I observed upon his forearm, invisible to casual inspection, indicated the administration of a powerful cardiac poison, most likely derived from digitalis. Carlo, with his criminal background and access to the victim, served as the instrument of murder, while the professor provided both the poison and the precise timing. Holmes began pacing, his movements sharp and decisive. Consider the psychological brilliance of the scheme. For 2 weeks, the neighbors had been conditioned to expect a candle in Markham's window at 10 o'clock precisely. When it appeared on the night of his death, every witness naturally assumed he was alive to light it. The impossible timeline created by this deception threw the police investigation into confusion and provided the professor with an unshakable alibi. The web of manipulation. The walking stick, Holmes continued, lifting the silver-headed cane, represented both the professor's trophy and his ultimate downfall. By taking it from Markham during their final interview, he demonstrated his complete domination over his victim. Yet, in pawning it through Carlo, he created the one piece of physical evidence that connected him directly to the crime. Holmes twisted the ornamental head, revealing again the hollow compartment that had contained Markham's liquidated assets. The professor's greed was systematic and thorough. He drained Markham's existing resources through intimidation, forced him to alter his will under duress, and then eliminated him on the eve of the inheritance transfer. Miss Montrose was to serve as the final instrument, signing away the £15,000 to complete the theft. And her role, I inquired, was she truly an unwilling participant? Miss Montrose occupied that grey area between victim and accomplice that makes such cases particularly poignant. Holmes replied thoughtfully. Her financial desperation made her vulnerable to the professor's initial approach, but her genuine affection for Markham ultimately proved stronger than her fear. When the moment came to complete the conspiracy, she chose conscience over self-preservation. The psychology of fear. Holmes returned to his chair, his expression reflecting both satisfaction and melancholy. The true genius of the professor's scheme lay not in the mechanical device, ingenious though it was, but in his understanding of human psychology. He transformed Markham's protective instincts into instruments of his own destruction. The candle ritual, which Markham believed provided security, actually established the precise conditions necessary for his murder to remain undetected. The newspaper advertisements served a similar purpose, he continued. They created a sense of communication and control that kept Markham compliant, while the net tightened around him. Each cryptic message reinforced his belief that escape remained possible, preventing the desperate actions that might have exposed the conspiracy prematurely. Holmes reached for his violin, his fingers absently plucking at the strings. Carlo's subsequent death by poisoning demonstrates the professor's ruthless efficiency in eliminating witnesses. No doubt, Miss Montrose would have suffered a similar fate once her usefulness ended, had we not intervened when we did. The satisfaction of justice. It was the locked room that first captured my attention. Holmes mused, but it was the human elements that ultimately solved the case. The professor's arrogance in taking trophies, Miss Montrose's moment of moral courage, even poor Markham's pathetic attempts to preserve some remnant of his fortune. Each contributed to the unraveling of what might otherwise have been the perfect crime. He set down the violin and fixed me with that penetrating gaze that marked his most serious observations. We have prevented a substantial theft and brought a murderer to justice, Watson. Yet I confess that the case leaves me with a sense of melancholy. Silas Markham died not from any great crime or passion, but simply because he possessed something that another man coveted. In the end, his greatest misfortune was not his fearful nature or his lonely existence, but his brief moment of unexpected wealth. The morning sun had climbed higher during our conversation, casting warm light through our windows and dispelling the last shadows of the fog that had shrouded the previous night's events. Holmes rose and moved to the window, gazing out at the bustling street below with that expression of quiet satisfaction that marked the conclusion of a successful investigation. "The game is ended, Watson," he said softly, "and justice has prevailed. Now, I believe Mrs. Hudson mentioned something about kippers for breakfast. Shall we attend to the more prosaic business of nourishment before the next puzzle presents itself at our door?" As I watched my friend's profile against the morning light, I reflected on the strange alchemy by which he transformed the most bewildering mysteries into logical narratives of human motivation and scientific principle. The impossible candle had been explained, the locked room penetrated, and the web of deception unraveled. Yet I knew that somewhere in London's vast expanse, other mysteries were already taking shape, waiting for the unique genius of Sherlock Holmes to illuminate their hidden truths. The days following Professor Ashford's arrest brought a steady stream of revelations that transformed our understanding of the case from an isolated crime into something far more sinister. Inspector Lestrade arrived at Baker Street on the fourth morning, bearing news that would cast the Markham affair in an entirely new light. The professor has been remarkably forthcoming during his interrogation, Lestrade announced, settling into his customary chair. Perhaps he takes some perverse pride in explaining his methods, but his confessions have revealed a criminal enterprise of unprecedented scope and organization. Holmes, who had been examining chemical samples at his workbench, turned with immediate interest. "Pray continue, Inspector. I suspected that Markham's case possessed characteristics inconsistent with a singular crime of opportunity." "Your instincts were correct, Mr. Holmes. Over the past 2 years, the professor orchestrated at least 4 similar murders, each involving solitary individuals who had recently inherited substantial sums. He maintained an extensive network of informants within solicitors' offices, banks, and probate courts who would alert him to suitable targets. Carlo Ferretti served as his primary instrument of coercion, while various unwitting accomplices, including Miss Montrose, were recruited to gain the victim's confidence. I felt a chill at this revelation. A systematic business of murder and theft. "Precisely, Doctor. The professor kept meticulous records, treating his crimes with the cold calculation of a commercial enterprise. His ledgers show profits exceeding £50,000, all obtained through the systematic elimination of vulnerable individuals whose only crime was unexpected wealth." The trial and its revelations. The proceedings at the Old Bailey drew considerable public attention, transforming the mysterious scandal into a symbol of scientific murder that captivated London's imagination. I attended several sessions, fascinated by the final act of our drama. Professor Ashford stood in the dock with icy composure, displaying the detached demeanor of a bored academic rather than a man facing the gallows. The most compelling moment came when Holmes took the stand to explain the galvanic device. As my friend detailed the precise calculations involving hydrogen gas and platinum powder, I observed a flicker of professional respect in the professor's eyes, the acknowledgement of one master craftsman by another, though they stood on opposite sides of the moral divide. The matter of Markham's inheritance proved legally complex. Since the will naming Miss Montrose had been drafted under clear duress, the Court of Chancery declared it invalid. However, during the investigation of the professor's papers, Whitmore discovered an earlier testamentary document that revealed Markham's true intentions. The bulk of his estate, including the Yorkshire inheritance, was to establish a charitable trust for the education of orphaned boys from his native county. A final irony Holmes observed when Whitmore informed us of this development. The professor plotted for months to seize a fortune that his victim had already given away in his heart, if not yet in law. There is a rough justice in that outcome. Letters from Paris. Several weeks passed before we received word of Miss Montrose. Her testimony had been crucial in securing the professor's conviction, and the Crown had shown leniency in recognition of her ultimate cooperation. Still, I had worried about her ability to rebuild a life shadowed by such dark associations. The letter arrived on a snowy January morning, written on heavy paper bearing the faint scent of violets I remembered from her St. John's Wood drawing room. Holmes read it silently before handing it to me with uncharacteristic gentleness. She wrote from Paris, where she had secured an engagement with a touring company, leaving behind the shadows of London and the memory of Silas Markham's tragic end. "I shall never forget that justice exists," she wrote, "even when it seems the darkness has won. You gave me back my life, Mr. Holmes, when I had all but surrendered it to fear. For that, and for the dignity you afforded poor Silas in his final rest, I remain eternally your debtor." Holmes's final reflection. As I folded the letter and placed it upon our mantelpiece, Holmes stood gazing into the fire with that distant expression I had learned to associate with deeper contemplation. "The case troubles me, Watson, not for its complexity, but for what it reveals about the evolution of criminal enterprise. The professor possessed intelligence, education, and every advantage of circumstance, yet he chose to employ these gifts in the systematic destruction of vulnerable individuals for financial gain." He turned from the fire, his expression grave. "We have witnessed something peculiarly modern and disturbing, the transformation of murder into a business enterprise conducted with the same detachment one might apply to railway investments. The professor was not driven by passion or conventional greed, but by the cold recognition of profit opportunity." Holmes moved to the window, gazing out at the snow-covered street. "We have stopped this particular enterprise, but I fear his methods may inspire imitators. The combination of scientific knowledge and complete moral emptiness creates a criminal type against which society has a few defenses." He paused, then smiled faintly. "Yet there is hope in the human heart's capacity for unexpected courage. Miss Montrose's moment of moral clarity, Markham's earlier charitable intentions, these remind us that goodness persists even in the darkest circumstances. The dead man's true signal was not the candle at 10 o'clock, but the unseen act by which he chose to benefit children who would never know his name. That light, Watson, no professor, however ingenious, could extinguish. The case of the candlelit window had revealed far more than a clever murder. It had provided a glimpse into both the depths of human calculation and the heights of human redemption. As the snow continued to fall beyond our windows, I reflected that justice, like the morning light, eventually penetrates even the deepest shadows. The weeks following Professor Ashford's conviction brought an unexpected visitor to Baker Street that would cast our entire investigation in a dramatically different light. I had been organizing my notes on the case, intending to chronicle the remarkable events surrounding the impossible candle, when Mrs. Hudson announced a Mr. Geoffrey Markham, recently returned from military service in India and identifying himself as Silas Markham's estranged younger brother. The brother's revelation. The man who entered our sitting room bore a striking resemblance to the deceased. though his features reflected the weathering of tropical climates and military discipline. His upright bearing and determined eyes spoke of a career officer accustomed to facing difficult truths. Holmes received him with characteristic courtesy, gesturing toward a chair near the fire. "Gentlemen," Geoffrey Markham began, his voice carrying the clipped precision of long service, "I have come not only to express gratitude for bringing my brother's murderer to justice, but to share information that fundamentally alters our understanding of these crimes." He withdrew a leather portfolio from his coat, its contents yellowed with age. "Silas and I were estranged for nearly 20 years, following a family disagreement that now seems tragically petty. I learned of his death only upon my return to England last month, but these documents explain why the professor targeted him specifically." Holmes leaned forward with renewed interest as Geoffrey spread the papers before us. "My brother was not merely a reclusive scholar, as most believed, but a former partner in Markham and Associates, a banking concern that collapsed under suspicious circumstances in 1873. The professor, then known simply as Edmund Ashford, financial consultant, served as primary advisor to that same institution. The revelation struck like a thunderbolt. "The connection predates the inheritance entirely," Holmes observed, his eyes sharp with calculation. "By more than 20 years, Mr. Holmes. The bank's collapse ruined several prominent families, and Silas bore much of the public blame, though he maintained his innocence until his dying day. He withdrew from society, changed his lodgings frequently, and lived in constant fear that those he had allegedly wronged would seek revenge." The true scope of the conspiracy. As Geoffrey Markham's narrative unfolded, the case assumed dimensions that our investigation had barely touched. The professor's scheme had not been merely opportunistic, but represented the culmination of decades of patient planning. Ashford had orchestrated the bank's collapse, using Silas Markham as his unwitting scapegoat while securing his own position and reputation. When circumstances brought news of Markham's impending inheritance to his attention, the professor recognized an opportunity to eliminate the one person who might eventually expose his original crimes while simultaneously profiting from the theft. "The inheritance was secondary," Holmes observed, rising to pace before the fireplace. "The primary objective was ensuring Markham's permanent silence regarding events from 2 decades past. The £15,000 merely sweetened an enterprise motivated primarily by self-preservation." "Precisely, Mr. Holmes. I have submitted these documents to the Crown Prosecutor, who believes they may warrant reopening investigations into the bank collapse. Several families ruined by that affair may yet see justice, and my brother's reputation will finally be restored." Holmes moved to the mantelpiece, where Markham's silver-headed walking stick rested alongside a modest candlestick that had recently arrived from Paris, Clara Montrose's graceful acknowledgement of our role in her redemption. He regarded both objects with thoughtful intensity. "Your brother lived in fear for 20 years, Mr. Markham, hunted by shadows both real and imagined. The professor exploited that fear with surgical precision, transforming Silas's protective instincts into instruments of his own destruction. It represents a peculiarly cruel species of murder, one that kills not merely the body, but the spirit long before the final blow falls. The evolution of criminal enterprise." After Geoffrey Markham departed, promising to keep us informed of developments regarding the bank investigation, Holmes remained at the window for some considerable time. The afternoon shadows lengthened across Baker Street, and the familiar sounds of evening commerce drifted up from below. The case assumes a different character. In light of these revelations, Watson, he said finally, what appeared to be random predation upon vulnerable individuals was actually the methodical elimination of potential threats to the professor's carefully constructed reputation. We have witnessed something peculiarly modern and disturbing, the transformation of murder into a systematic business enterprise, conducted with the same detachment one might apply to railway investments. He turned from the window, his expression grave. We live in an age of increasing complexity, my dear fellow. The old certainties that governed criminal behavior, passion, greed, revenge, are being supplanted by something more calculated and methodical. The professor represents a new species of criminal, one who approaches murder with the detachment of a businessman evaluating investments. Holmes moved to his chemical apparatus, where the remains of his galvanic demonstration still occupied the table. As science advances, so too does the ingenuity of the criminal mind. We have seen the telegraph used to coordinate frauds, chemistry employed to mask poisons, and now clockwork mechanisms deployed to create impossible alibis. The professor's device is but a harbinger of a future where the laboratory becomes as dangerous as the fog-bound alley. Symbolic resolution. As evening settled over London, Holmes prepared his pipe with methodical care, his movements reflecting the contemplative mood that had descended upon him. He gestured toward the mantelpiece, where the walking stick and candlestick stood side by side. There, Watson, you have the whole story in miniature, the instrument of calculation and the symbol of remembrance. The first served a scoundrel's 20-year campaign of deception. The second commemorates both a victim and a penitent. Between the two lies the entire narrative of human choice, the capacity for both elaborate evil and unexpected redemption. I settled into my chair, grateful for the warmth of our sitting room and the companionship of my remarkable friend. Yet, for all his intelligence and planning, the professor was undone by the same human weaknesses that have destroyed criminals since time immemorial: arrogance, greed, and the inability to resist taking trophies. Indeed, the walking stick he took from Markham was his downfall, as surely as any confession extracted under interrogation. But there was another element he could not calculate: Miss Montrose's moment of moral courage when conscience overcame fear. The human capacity for unexpected choice remains the ultimate defense against even the most elaborate criminal conspiracies. The writer's reflection. Holmes glanced toward my desk, where my notebook lay open beside a freshly filled pen. You are writing, I perceive, he remarked with that slight smile that accompanied his more theatrical observations, attempting, no doubt, to add a veneer of literary romanticism to what was, in essence, a simple logical exercise in cause and effect. I am recording the facts, Holmes, I replied, though I knew his criticism contained its usual grain of truth. Though I confess the tragic figure of Silas Markham continues to haunt me, to live in such perpetual fear that one's only comfort is a nightly signal to the darkness. It represents a terrible, lonely existence. Fear, Watson, is the most primal of human motivators, far more potent than greed or love. The professor understood this fundamental truth. He did not merely kill Markham. He constructed a prison of terror around him, using the man's own protective habits as unbreakable iron bars. It was, in its way, an architectural triumph of psychological cruelty. Holmes rose and moved to his violin case, lifting the instrument with reverence he rarely accorded to human beings. However, my dear fellow, you know my rule regarding your literary efforts. I never read accounts of my own cases. They bias the judgment and encourage vanity. Write it for those honest souls who still prefer a rational world to one peopled with ghosts. Tell them that the candle in the window was lit by clockwork, not a corpse, and that while human greed grows ever more ingenious, so too does human reason. The Eternal Vigil. As Holmes raised the violin to his chin, the room filled with the melancholy sweetness of a Bach partita. I watched him as he played, his sharp features softened by the music and firelight. In these moments, the cold logic machine vanished, replaced by the artist whose soul vibrated with sensitivity he strove so hard to conceal. Yet even as the music swelled, filling the comfortable silence of our Baker Street refuge, I knew this tranquility was but a pause between storms. Somewhere in London's vast expanse, other mysteries were already taking shape, other crimes being planned or committed, other victims crying out for justice. The professor had been swept away, but as Holmes had observed, the web remained, spun in the shadows of our great metropolis. The case of the candlelit window had reached its conclusion, revealing not merely a clever murder, but a decades-long campaign of systematic destruction, orchestrated by a mind of exceptional cunning and complete moral emptiness. Yet it had also demonstrated the enduring power of human courage, scientific reasoning, and the patient pursuit of truth. The candle that had burned in Silas Markham's window, first as his desperate signal of safety, then as the professor's mechanical deception, had been extinguished forever, but the light of justice had illuminated the shadows where evil had hidden for so long, and in our own window the steady glow continued to burn as a beacon of reason in an often chaotic and unpredictable world. As the final notes of the partita faded into silence, I closed my notebook and prepared for sleep, knowing that tomorrow would bring new challenges, fresh mysteries, and the eternal struggle between the forces of order and chaos that define the human condition. The game, as Holmes was fond of observing, was never truly finished. It merely paused between moves, gathering strength for the next engagement in humanity's endless contest with the darkness. The weeks following the conclusion of the Markham affair brought with them that peculiar mixture of satisfaction and melancholy that invariably accompanied the resolution of our more complex cases. Holmes had returned to his customary routine of chemical experiments and violin practice, yet I observed in his manner a thoughtfulness that suggested the case continued to occupy his mind in ways that transcended mere professional interest. The mechanical ingenuity of the professor's scheme had been thoroughly exposed, the criminal brought to justice, and the victim's reputation restored, yet something in the deeper implications of the affair seemed to trouble my friend's analytical spirit. Letters from the North. It was during this period of quiet reflection that a letter arrived bearing the familiar hand of Geoffrey Markham, now writing from a small village in the West Riding of Yorkshire, where his brother's charitable trust had begun its work. Holmes read the correspondence with evident interest before passing it to me, his expression softening in a manner I had rarely witnessed. The letter described the establishment of the Markham Educational Trust, funded entirely by the inheritance that had once served as bait for the professor's deadly scheme. Geoffrey had overseen the conversion of a modest stone rectory into a school for orphaned boys, where 12 young scholars now pursued their studies under the guidance of a retired Cambridge don. The curriculum emphasized both classical learning and practical skills, Latin and mathematics, alongside bookkeeping and mechanical drawing, preparing these sons of miners and tradesmen for opportunities their birth had not promised. Enclosed with the letter was a small photograph, somewhat blurred, but clearly showing a group of laughing boys assembled before their new school. In the corner, barely visible in the shadow of the doorway, stood a simple brass plaque bearing the inscription, "The Markham Trust." In grateful memory of Silas Henry Markham, scholar and benefactor. For several moments after examining this image, I found myself oddly moved by the transformation of tragedy into hope, of a fortune that had attracted murder, now dedicated to nurturing young minds. Holmes, observing my reaction with characteristic perceptiveness, rose and moved to the fireplace, where he began preparing his pipe with methodical care. "You perceive, Watson," he remarked, "how the consequences of a case may extend far, beyond the immediate resolution of the crime itself. The professor sought to steal a dead man's legacy, yet that same legacy now provides life and opportunity to children who might otherwise have faced poverty and ignorance." The professor's final message. Our contemplation of these happier developments was interrupted by news of a more sobering nature. Inspector Lestrade arrived one grey February morning to inform us that Professor Ashford had been executed at Newgate Prison, maintaining his composure to the end and expressing no remorse for his crimes. More significantly, the professor had left behind a detailed journal documenting his criminal methodology, which he had specifically requested be delivered to Holmes. The volume proved to be a disturbing testament to systematic evil, containing precise instructions for the galvanic device, detailed case studies of previous murders, and a chilling analysis of victim psychology. Each crime was recorded with the detachment of a natural philosopher documenting laboratory experiments, treating human lives as variables in mathematical equations. The journal's final entry addressed Holmes directly, suggesting that their methods differed only in moral application, not fundamental approach. Holmes studied this document with the same clinical interest he applied to any piece of evidence, yet I could see that the professor's final challenge had affected him more deeply than he cared to admit. "The man poses an uncomfortable question, Watson," he observed after closing the journal. "He suggests that the boundary between detective and criminal lies not in methodology but in moral framework. There is disturbing truth in that observation, for I too manipulate circumstances and employ deception to achieve desired outcomes." "Yet the distinction remains absolute," I replied firmly. "You serve justice while he served only himself. The methods may appear similar, but the purposes are fundamentally opposed." Holmes nodded slowly, yet his expression remained troubled. "The professor represents what happens when exceptional intelligence operates without ethical constraints. As scientific knowledge advances, we must guard against the emergence of others who would pervert discovery into instruments of destruction. The criminal of the future will not wield a cudgel, but a formula, and society must prepare accordingly." Reflections on Justice and Redemption. As spring gradually displaced the harsh London winter, we received additional correspondence that completed our understanding of the case's human dimensions. Clara Montrose wrote from Paris, where she had secured a position with a respected theatrical company, her talent finally receiving the recognition that desperation had once prevented. Her letter spoke of gradual healing from the trauma of her involvement in the professor's scheme, and her gratitude for the opportunity to rebuild her life with dignity intact. The investigation into the collapsed bank had meanwhile revealed the full scope of Ashford's earlier crimes, leading to the posthumous restoration of several reputations and the provision of compensation to families ruined by his manipulations 2 decades past. The wheels of justice, though slow to turn, had ultimately ground exceeding fine, ensuring that the professor's web of deception was completely unraveled. Holmes, reviewing these various outcomes one evening as we sat before the fire, made an observation that seemed to encapsulate the entire affair. The case began with an impossible candle burning in a dead man's window, Watson, yet its true illumination lay in revealing the capacity for both elaborate evil and unexpected redemption that exists within the human heart. The professor's mechanical device was merely sleight of hand. The real magic lay in transforming a fortune built on fear into a foundation for hope. The enduring mystery. As I prepared my notes for publication, organizing the complex threads of deception and revelation into a coherent narrative, Holmes made his customary protest against literary embellishment. Yet I detected in his manner a recognition that this particular case deserved careful preservation, not merely as an intellectual exercise, but as a testament to the eternal struggle between light and darkness that defines the human condition. Write it faithfully, Watson, he instructed, but remember that the greatest mysteries are not always those we solve through deduction. The transformation of Silas Markham from terrified victim to posthumous benefactor, Clara Montrose's moment of moral courage, even the professor's ability to maintain his facade of respectability while orchestrating systematic murder, these represent puzzles of human nature that no amount of logical analysis can fully illuminate. The candlelit window that had first drawn our attention had long since been extinguished, its mechanical secret exposed, and its creator brought to account. Yet, in our own Baker Street lodgings, the steady glow of reason continued to burn, casting its light into the shadows where evil might lurk, and offering hope to those who sought justice in an uncertain world. The game, as Holmes was fond of observing, was never truly concluded. It merely paused between moves, gathering strength for the next engagement in humanity's endless contest with the forces of darkness. As I set down my pen and prepared for sleep, I reflected that while we had solved the mystery of the impossible candle, we had also discovered something far more valuable: the enduring power of human conscience to triumph over even the most elaborate schemes of the wicked. In the laughter of Yorkshire orphans learning their letters, in the applause greeting a reformed actress on a Parisian stage, and in the quiet satisfaction of a detective who had once again served the cause of justice, the true light continued to shine, undimmed by all the professor's mechanical contrivances and immune to the fog that so often shrouded our great city. The case was closed, but its lessons would endure, reminding us that while criminal ingenuity might advance with the march of science, so too would the methods of those who stood guard against the darkness. And in that eternal vigil, there remained cause for hope that reason guided by conscience would always find a way to prevail over brilliance divorced from humanity. The manuscript lay completed upon my desk, its final page bearing the date and my signature in fresh ink. I had titled it The Case of the Candlelit Window, though I suspected Holmes would find fault with what he would undoubtedly term my theatrical embellishments. The spring afternoon light filtering through our Baker Street windows seemed to mock the memory of those fog-shrouded November evenings when the mystery had first presented itself, yet I found myself oddly reluctant to set aside the chronicle of events that had so thoroughly engaged our faculties. Holmes emerged from his chemical corner, wiping his stained fingers upon a much abused towel, his expression bearing that peculiar mixture of satisfaction and melancholy that invariably followed the successful conclusion of a complex case. He had spent the morning in correspondence with various scientific journals, pursuing some obscure research that he claimed bore upon the criminal applications of legitimate discovery. "Finished with your literary endeavors, Watson?" he inquired, settling into his chair with characteristic grace. "I trust you have maintained some semblance of your factual accuracy beneath the inevitable romantic veneer." Before I could respond to his familiar criticism, our conversation was interrupted by the arrival of the afternoon post, which included, among its contents, a small package bearing my name in an unfamiliar hand. The accompanying letter, written upon expensive paper, explained that the sender, a Mr. Geoffrey Hartwell of Bloomsbury, had discovered the enclosed volume among his late uncle's effects, and thought it might interest the chronicler of the Markham affair, the professor's literary source. The slim volume proved to be a privately printed monograph, titled Applied Galvanism in Domestic Signaling Devices, authored by one A. H. Penrith, and published some 15 years earlier. Holmes seized upon it immediately, his eyes brightening with that peculiar intensity that marked significant discoveries. "Observe, Watson," he said, turning the pages with practiced care. "Here is described almost precisely the principle employed in our professor's deadly device: the timed closure of electrical circuits, the ignition of treated wicks through galvanic sparks, even the concealment of mechanisms within architectural features, all detailed with innocent academic precision." I examined the relevant passages, struck by the uncomfortable realization that legitimate scientific inquiry had provided the blueprint for murder. "You suggest the professor derived his methods from this work?" "Undoubtedly. Note the marginalia in this particular copy, faint pencil marks that correspond exactly to the elements of his scheme." Our professor was not the brilliant innovator he believed himself to be, but merely a clever plagiarist who perverted another man's honest research to serve his murderous purposes. Holmes closed the volume thoughtfully, his expression grave. "This discovery illuminates a disturbing truth about our modern age, Watson. As scientific knowledge advances and becomes more widely disseminated through publication, so too does the potential for its criminal application. The same principles that might inspire one man to improve domestic lighting may suggest to another how to create an unshakable alibi for murder." The evolution of criminal enterprise. Rising from his chair, Holmes began that familiar pacing that indicated his mind was grappling with implications beyond the immediate case. "We stand at the threshold of a new era in criminal investigation, my dear fellow. The crimes of the coming century will require detectives who are as much scientists as policemen. The days of following muddy footprints and questioning witnesses in alehouses are rapidly drawing to a close." He paused before our mantelpiece, where Clara Montrose's modest candlestick still stood beside Markham's recovered walking stick, twin symbols of the case's resolution. Yet, for all the professor's mechanical ingenuity, he was undone by the same fundamental weaknesses that have destroyed criminals since time immemorial: arrogance, greed, and the fatal inability to calculate the human heart's capacity for unexpected courage. "Miss Montrose's moment of moral clarity," I observed, "when conscience overcame fear." "Precisely. The professor could devise elaborate mechanisms and manipulate complex financial schemes, but he could not predict when a frightened woman would choose justice over self-preservation. In that miscalculation lay his downfall for all his scientific pretensions. The enduring light. Holmes moved to the window, gazing out at the bustling afternoon traffic of Baker Street. The case began with an impossible candle burning in a dead man's window, Watson. Yet its true illumination lay in revealing both the depths of human calculation and the heights of human redemption. The professor's mechanical device was merely sleight of hand. The real magic lay in transforming a fortune built on fear into a foundation for hope. As evening approached and the gas lamps began to flicker to life throughout London, I reflected on the strange journey that had led us from that first fog-shrouded night to this moment of quiet resolution. The impossible signal had been explained, the locked room penetrated, and the web of conspiracy unraveled. Yet the greatest mystery, the capacity of the human spirit to choose light over darkness, remained as profound as ever. "You know my rule regarding your literary efforts," Holmes said, returning to his chair and reaching for his violin. "I never read accounts of my own cases. They encourage vanity and bias the judgment. But write this one faithfully, Watson. Tell your readers that the candle in the window was lit by clockwork, not a corpse, and that while criminal ingenuity may advance with the march of science, so too will the methods of those who stand guard against the darkness." As the first notes of a Bach partita filled our sitting room, I gathered my completed manuscript and prepared it for the publisher's consideration. The case of the candlelit window had reached its conclusion, but its lessons would endure, a reminder that reason guided by conscience must always prevail over brilliance divorced from humanity. Outside our windows, London's countless lights began their nightly vigil against the gathering dark. Each flame represented a small victory over the shadows, a testament to the enduring power of human decency in a world where evil might disguise itself with scientific precision, but could never ultimately triumph over the patient pursuit of truth. The game, as Holmes was fond of observing, was never truly finished. It merely paused between moves, gathering strength for the next engagement in humanity's eternal contest with the forces of darkness. The candlelit window of Montague Street had been forever extinguished, but in our Baker Street refuge, the steady glow of justice continued to burn, ready to illuminate whatever mysteries the future might bring.